Let's get more now from Colonel Simon Diggins, who served as UK attaché in Kabul, the Afghan capital. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Colonel Diggins. And from a military standpoint, what is your reaction to the objectives and so far the nature of the Israeli and American military action in Iran, what Donald Trump is calling a major combat operation? Good to have you with us.
Good afternoon. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the Armada buildup suggests that something significant was going to happen. So it was not going to be a sort of token operation in order to put pressure on the Iranians. We heard that the build-up was closer to the build-up in 2003, prior to the Gulf War then. So clearly something major was planned. I think the words that now starting to come out from people like President Trump, talking about this in a once-in-a-generation, we've actually talked about generational change to the Iranian people, suggests the room for a long conflict.
Now, Iran already retaliating against Israel and US bases across the Gulf. Does this signal that we're in an inevitable direct state-on-state conflicts, and just how much is this going to spread?
Well, that is also going to be their reaction. They always said they would react, and they said there'd be a significant reaction to any attack by Israel and by America. So nothing new there. And I think the difference is now, if you compare it back to a couple of weeks ago, or rather a month or so ago, when the height of the then Iranian people's revolt against the government in Tehran, President Trump at the time encouraged the Iranian people to rise up against them, but had nothing in place. I think what we've now got in place is not just the forces to attack, but also the forces to defend. And so I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. We've seen, and Jordan, for example, has reported, it's knocked down 2 ballistic missiles fired from Iran into its airspace. So I think that's the kind of conflict we're going to see for a while. Exchange of missiles, exchange of attacks, and I think that'll be the nature of it for at least for 2 or 3 days.
And what can we gather so far about the likely targets of the strikes so far? And there are media reports that the United States and Israel are actually dividing labour on this military operation, with the Americans taking care of the nuclear sites and perhaps Israel focusing on Iran's ballistic missile programme and military facilities.
Well, it would make common sense to actually allocate the sort of targeting to those countries who are most able to conduct those operations. Again, you look back to last year, to June 25, when there were the attacks on the Iranian nuclear facilities. The Israelis conducted a lot of operations against, first of all, Iranian air defences, and then some of the sites they could get at. But some of the more difficult to get at sites, particularly those that were in bunkers, were left to the Americans, because the Americans had the appropriate ordnance in which to conduct that. So I expect there's been a division of responsibility between the Israelis and the Americans, looking at each target in turn and working out which is the best way to prosecute that, and then using the appropriate weapons and the appropriate air forces and missile systems to attack those sites.
And Colonel Diggins, we've seen missile interceptions so far in Qatar, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, including near to the US 5th Fleet headquarters. How exposed are US and other Western bases in the region, and how sophisticated are these interceptor capabilities?
Well, they are sophisticated, and of course the bases are vulnerable, and indeed one of the things that the Iranians made clear was that they would attack those bases. And again, I think this goes back to the wider regional issue, because I think what the other thing that happened after when President Trump talked about supporting the Iranian people in the earlier period, in sort of December, January, was that local regional countries, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, said this is fine. We accept that we'll be a target. We need to do something to defend us. So what we've now seen, as I said, is the build-up of the defensive side as well as the offensive side. So I think we're now getting that kind of sort of response and counter-response from both sides. And they are sophisticated, there's no question about it. The level of sophistication you require in order to knock down a ballistic missile is high. And that's what I think was taking time to build up prior to this particular attack happening.
And you touched on it before, but considering the signalling that the US strikes were possible, and how much preparation do you think that the military in Iran had for preparing for protecting its stockpile of missiles and launchers, for example, and getting its top political and military figures to safe locations?
But I think they'll have been watching with extreme interest the kind of build-up of US forces in the region. And we heard last week that, for example, they had established a sort of chain of command to take place if and when some of their senior leadership were removed, wounded, or simply had to be kept out of communications for their own safety. So they'll have done their best to try and build up for that. And indeed, they tried their best to recover from the attacks last year. I mean, they've got a stockpile of about 3,000 ballistic missiles, which is a huge amount of missiles. They fired some 500 of in the operations last year in response to Israeli and US attacks. But they managed to rebuild a lot of that stockpile since then. So they've all been thinking about this for a while in exactly the same way as the Americans and the Israelis have as well.
And finally, what indicators should we be watching out for now, do you think? What should we be looking out for in the next, say, 48 hours to gauge just how much this is going to escalate or perhaps stabilise or find some sort of off-ramp diplomatically?
Well, sure. I think the off-ramp is not going to be an early off-ramp, I think is the first and honest answer. I think it will take a little bit of time to see what the results are going to be. We're getting back some reporting at the moment about where some of the targeting, but neither side's going to be very honest about what they've hit or they haven't had, because it does take time for intelligence analysts to work out how effective they have been or not. But I would suspect that we will continue to see a significant amount of force being used over the next 48 hours or so, and then there may be a kind of an operational pause, but it may be an operational pause just to analyse what damage has been done and also to gauge whatever reactions are incoming. But I don't expect this to happen to cease early. I think we're in for a long run against the Iranian regime.
Simon, we really appreciate your input today. Thank you so much for joining us. Colonel Simon Diggins, former UK attaché in Kabul.